For years, he was the fastest man on Earth, a legend, an icon, a force of nature. The world knew his name, Usain Bolt. But in April, something strange happened. He vanished. No cameras, no interviews, no races. The man who once ruled the track disappeared without a trace. At first, people thought he was simply taking time off, perhaps training in secret, preparing for one last spectacular comeback. But the truth was far more bizarre than anyone could have imagined. Far from the roaring stadiums and flashing lights, Usain Bolt was about to face the biggest challenge of his life, a challenge where speed alone wouldn't be enough. His story would become the stuff of legend, a tale of survival, endurance, and an impossible journey that no one saw coming. But the question remains, how did he get here? Somewhere deep in the heart of Africa, far from the world he knew, Usain Bolt opened his eyes. The sun blazed overhead. His body ached. His breath was heavy. He was no longer surrounded by the familiar sound of cheering crowds, only the whisper of the wind and the distant calls of wild animals. He was alone. But how? How did he end up here? Perhaps he had been caught in a storm, lost during travel, or maybe fate had simply played a cruel trick. One thing was certain. He was far from home, and no one knew where he was. For the first time in his life, speed couldn't save him. With no food, no water, and no sense of direction, Bolt had no choice but to push forward. Step by step, mile by mile, he ran. Not for medals, not for glory, but for survival. Days passed. His muscles, once built for explosive power, now carried him through exhaustion. He tried to find food, but the land was unfamiliar. His body, used to discipline and training, now struggled against hunger and fatigue. But Bolt had something that couldn't be measured in seconds or world records: his will to keep going. And so the fastest man on Earth found himself in a race unlike any other. A race against time, against nature, against the limits of human endurance. Still, he had no idea what lay ahead. After days of endless running, Usain Bolt reached the outskirts of a small village. His body was weak, his mind clouded by exhaustion, but his instincts told him this was his only chance. He stood near the edge of a riverbank, scanning the settlement ahead. Smoke rose from cooking fires, voices carried in the wind, and the scent of food drifted through the air. But something held him back. Despite his desperation, Bolt hesitated. He had spent his life under the watchful eyes of millions, yet now he felt exposed in a way he never had before. What would the villagers think? Would they recognize him? Would they even believe who he was? Then hunger made the decision for him. Step by step, he moved toward the largest building in sight, his vision blurred from fatigue. What he didn't know was that this place wasn't just any structure, it was the local ranger station. With the last of his strength, Bolt collapsed near the entrance. His breathing was ragged, his face drenched in sweat. He had nothing left to give. Moments later, the door creaked open. A ranger stepped outside and froze. Before him lay a man who seemed both familiar and unrecognizable. His clothes were torn, his body battered, yet there was something undeniable about him. Could it really be Usain Bolt? The ranger quickly called for help. More villagers gathered, their whispers turning to gasps as they recognized the fallen figure. But Bolt didn't hear them. His mind drifted into darkness. He had outrun the wild, but had he run out of time? When Usain Bolt awoke, he wasn't in the wild anymore. He was lying on a makeshift bed inside the ranger station. The room was dimly lit, the scent of herbs and medicine lingering in the air. Around him, villagers whispered in disbelief. Some had seen him on TV, others had only heard the name, but now the fastest man in history was here, broken, exhausted, and lost. The rangers assessed his condition. His body, once the pinnacle of athleticism, was now weak from starvation and dehydration. His feet were blistered, his muscles strained beyond their limits. One thing was clear: he couldn't survive here much longer. The villagers, moved by his struggle, vowed to help. They fed him, gave him water, and let him rest. But Bolt's eyes often wandered toward the horizon, longing for the place he called home. News of his whereabouts spread quickly. Calls were made. Authorities got involved. The Jamaican government, shocked by the discovery, worked with emergency officials to bring him back. But there was a problem. Bolt was in a remote region, far from major roads or airports. The only way to get him out was by air. The regional governor contacted the Minister of Emergency Situations, requesting a helicopter for a rescue mission never attempted before. Meanwhile, the Rangers and local engineers built a special transport cage designed to keep Bolt secure during the flight, just in case he panicked mid-air. It took 8 days of planning, but finally, the operation was set. As the helicopter descended into the village, the crowd gathered. Some cheered, others prayed. Bolt, now stronger but still weak, stepped forward. For the first time since his ordeal began, he was going home. But just as the mission seemed like a success, something happened that no one expected. As the helicopter lifted off, carrying Usain Bolt away from the village, relief spread through the crowd. They had done the impossible, rescued the fastest man on Earth from a fate no one could have imagined. But then, something went wrong. A sudden noise echoed through the aircraft. The pilots exchanged nervous glances. Bolt had woken up. The team had sedated him slightly to keep him calm, but now his instincts were kicking in. His eyes darted around, his breathing quickened. He was trapped inside a metal cage, thousands of feet in the air. For a man built to run, confinement was terrifying. The Rangers held their breath. If Bolt panicked, if he moved too suddenly, the helicopter could lose control. Every second felt like an eternity. But then, something incredible happened. Bolt didn't fight. Instead, he stayed calm. He studied his surroundings, his heartbeat steadying. He had spent his whole life training for pressure. This was just another test. The flight continued without incident. And after what felt like hours, the helicopter finally touched down on Jamaican soil. Usain Bolt was home. The world erupted in celebration. The media flooded every headline. Bolt returns from the wilderness. The fastest man on Earth survives the impossible. Doctors confirmed that while he was weak, his body had endured the unimaginable. In time, he would fully recover. But just when everyone thought the story had ended, fate had one more surprise. Months later, disaster struck. A severe hurricane battered the Jamaican coast, leaving destruction in its wake. Entire villages were left stranded without aid, roads were impassable, and supplies were running low. Then, when hope seemed lost, a familiar figure appeared. Usain Bolt. Fully recovered, stronger than ever, he ran. Through flooded streets, over broken roads, he delivered supplies to the stranded. Where cars and machines failed, his legs carried him forward. He became the hero his people needed. A man who once ran for gold, now ran for something greater. He had survived the wild. He had been rescued by strangers. Now it was his turn to give back. As the sun set over Jamaica, Bolt stood at the highest peak, looking out at the land that had raised him. The fastest man in the world had returned, not just as an athlete, but as a legend.